Hello again, guys. It is Free 700. We are back talking about Warhammer 40K lore. This time, what the fuck is Hive Fleet Jormungandr? Now, Jormungandr is Norse mythology for world serpent. The serpent that pretty much encompasses the world because it's that large of a giant. Now, Jormungandr, the Hive Fleet, pretty much takes up that notion. And I actually enjoy it a lot as far as lore goes. It's a very cunning serpent, and its lore has to deal with the Ghoul stars, which we're going to be talking about quite a bit. Now you see Hive Fleet Kraken, Hive Fleet Leviathan, they came at the galaxy from roughly around the same areas. They did come at different directions, but they're more or less in the same confined space. So this is where Jormungandr is extremely scary, because Jormungandr did not arrive from the east, didn't arrive from the south. Instead, it arrived from the far, far north of the galaxy. It entered into the region known as the Ghoul stars. Now, the Ghoul stars is a very fascinating area because it's dead, so there's really no reason for a Tyranid to go there, but it does have a throne, which I have talked about in one of my lore videos, called the Sheriax, which is a very powerful psychic throne that probably attracted the damn thing. But it's really a scary notion, the idea that this fleet came from a different direction entirely than the other Hive fleets. It actually makes it more horrifying to realize that in a universe with billions and billions and billions of years of evolution, only one galaxy, it seems, is untouched by the Tyranid invasion. And that would be where we are. So it's a very scary idea that here we are fighting chaos, fighting demons, fighting everything in the fucking galaxy. But as far as the universe is concerned, we're fighting a much greater threat, which is the Tyranids, as they have pillaged whole galaxies. And they're coming from every direction that our galaxy can ever fucking think of. So Jormungandr obviously scares the shit out of a lot of people. Now you may think to yourself, Freezer 700, what exactly is Hive Fleet Jormungandr though? All you've said is pretty much where they're from, you've said why they're so important, but you haven't really said what they are. Well, here's what they are. You see, Jormungandr is actually a subtle Hive Fleet. They're not like the other ones where they'll just ravage a world and swarm it with thousands and thousands of life forms. No, they don't do that. You see, Jormungandr fights with intellects and extreme cunning that we have never really seen that much of. What Jormungandr does is they employ a lot of Raveners, a lot of Molochs, a lot of Trigons, and what they do is they burrow into the planet. They burrow into its crust. Now, this provides a lot of advantages. One advantage is that, sometimes the enemy doesn't even realize that Tyranids are on their planet. 2, it's a very protected way of hiding yourself. See, you could hide in the forest and use camouflage, but there's always that risk that someone could come up with thermal goggles or infrared or some other way of detection to see you out, maybe even psychers. But the Raveners, the Molochs, and the Trigons, they burrow deep into the mountains. They actually go underneath the very foundations of the Hive worlds. And the Hive worlds, some of them burrow all the way into the planet's crust. So these guys burrow deep, 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 down deep, where your brain goes numb. That kind of situation. So this provides a lot of protection, because then what happens is if someone actually knows that these things are on their planet, that they're in the planet's crust, down deep, the issue becomes is that what can you do about it? They don't leave a cave or a tunnel. They don't need to come out to feed. They're just stuck there in your planet until you forget about them, and that's when they're going to strike. So the only other way to deal with it is to just destroy the whole planet. Just outright blow the planet up. But is that really necessary? Is that really a logical answer? What if your world is a very important industrial world? What if your world is a very holy world? What if your world is a fortress world staving off chaos? Yeah, destroying a planet just because you have one Moloch or one Trigon in it is not exactly a reasonable idea, and it's not a logical one either. This is where Jormungandr is very, very powerful, is that the other Hive fleets, you can beat them back, you can beat them off, and there is a possibility you can eradicate them off of a world, even their spores out of the atmosphere. But Jormungandr, you will never get rid of. You can never safely say 100% certainty that it is gone. It will always, always, always be there. So, Jormungandr, although a very interesting Tyranid force, it's not necessarily the strongest, but it is the most scary. It's definitely the most survivable. Because then what would happen is Jormungandr, you could easily beat it back. Just don't let it land on your planet. Woohoo, now we're safe. And this is what happened with Gedrin 2, a planet that is mostly water, but they did have a fortress where they just blasted away all these comets and all this debris that Hive Fleet Jormungandr was sending, hurling down to the planet, which is pretty typical. That's pretty normal for Tyranids to do that. So, with only a few asteroids just landing in the ocean, they just figured, hey, we don't see any life scans, there's no way anything lived, because so far Hive Fleet Jormungandr is just pretty much sending asteroids at us. They're not actually sending, like, spores at us. So, hey, we should be safe. The fleet probably realized we're too strong for its own good. And then a few months later, big trouble happened. Scores and scores of Ravener broods and Molochs bursting inside the fortress, destroying the very foundations of many of their gun turrets, just laying waste to the men while they're cozy and sleeping, causing total disarray in their defenses. And of course, they're attacking the fortress right when those Tyranid bioships pop right back up into orbit, right back on their sensors. So now the defenders are scrambling to beat off the tunneling broods that they're fighting, but meanwhile try to somehow muster up a defense for the sky when the spores come running down, when the asteroids come back. Now, speaking of asteroids, Jormungandr seems to be very special in the sense that they cling a lot to the space. They seem to cling on to comets. There was a mention and report of a few comets actually bearing Tyranids on it, which was most likely Jormungandr. They use a lot of asteroids to hide their bioships, and it seems like when they invade worlds, unlike most Tyranids who just send a shit ton of spores, they would instead just send asteroids, which is pretty damn clever. It saves you a lot of essence, a lot of that biomass, but it's also pretty interesting because then what would happen is the enemy gets a little too cozy. They keep blasting asteroid after asteroid, and then they just assume, just like Gedrin 2, like, oh, it was just rocks they were sending at us. They were trying to weaken us. But they failed. They didn't stand the might of humanity. And then it turns out one of those asteroids actually had a few spores on it, had a few nasty broods attached to it. Now, this also provides great defense in space and great ambushing tactics in space, because what would happen is it's very hard to scan for bioships in an asteroid. It's very, very, very difficult. I mean, today's world, we actually do find some asteroids that do have very ancient bacteria on it. So if your ship is scanning bacterial or microbial signs on an asteroid, you're just going to ignore it. You're not going to realize that those asteroids that are brushing against your ship are leaving spores of Tyranids on it. In the next planet you get to, that spore is going to fucking flourish. So this is, again, one of the issues with Jormungandr is that it's actually probably the most widespread Hive fleet, just because it keeps infecting the rocks and the asteroids, the comets. And if you've never seen a meteor strike a planet, I highly recommend you do. It's not this big cataclysmic event. No, most of the time it's just this tiny little rock that just boop lands on the ground, and then doesn't leave much of an impact, doesn't leave much of anything really. It's just this tiny withered away rock that boop jumps onto the surface of your planet. This, of course, is very, very, very deadly for everybody in the world, because if all the Tyranids do, or more importantly, the Tyranids of Hive Fleet Jormungandr do, is they just keep infecting comets and just have comets zooming up and down the galaxy. Who knows? In 900 years, they could probably be in every fucking planet in the galaxy. In maybe 10,000 years, There is not a single rock in the galaxy they do not have some sort of presence on. And this becomes an issue because we don't know the extent of Hive Fleet Jormungandr's destruction, the extent of Hive Fleet Jormungandr's reach. There has been some other Hive Fleets who have utilized Hive Fleet Jormungandr, like Hive Fleet Leviathan went to one planet, and they sent out a psychic stimulus, and at first, the Imperium was kind of confused, like, I wonder what they're sending the stimulus out to. Boom! Out from the fucking surface comes all these Hive Fleet Jormungandr forces. This is what I mean, though. Your planet doesn't necessarily need to be attacked by Jormungandr to have Jormungandr forces in it. This is extremely scary and extremely deadly to be fighting against. And it's one of those things where you're like, why doesn't all the other Tyranid fleets do this? Well, here's the answer. You see, every Hive fleet comes from different origins. Every Hive fleet comes from fighting different monsters, different species, different civilizations. And each Hive fleet has developed their own mutations, their own ways of fighting, their own ways of warfare. And you do see it where some of the Hive fleets have been slowly changing to fight certain races like orcs, humanity, Eldar. They do change and they do adapt. Now, Jormungandr's adaptation, I actually think makes a lot of sense for the Ghoul stars. Now, we could theorize that maybe they were just from a galaxy where many species were like mole people, where they like to live deep underground, and the only way to really attack them was to burrow deep underground, like a bunch of dwarves. Maybe this is a Hive fleet that fought the Skaven for thousands and thousands of years. Who knows, right? We don't know much about these other galaxies. But we do know this. Hive Fleet Jormungandr went to the Ghoul Stars. And the Ghoul Stars is a very obscure area. Back in 5th edition, they said Hive Fleet Jormungandr came out twisted and unusual when they exited the stars. Which makes sense because it's a very peculiar region of space where the warp doesn't really seem to exist. There's a lot of death for no real reason. There's just a lot of mystery about this area. It's got a lot of weird Xenos species that are just too alien to comprehend and too extra-dimensional to really exist. Now, if the Hive Fleet was existing in this area, it makes sense why they fight the way they do. It makes sense why they do not attack their opponents head-on. It makes sense why they would bombard the planet with a bunch of asteroids instead of sending biomass down. The reason is if we look at Helbrecht, the Helbrecht of the Black Templar, the High Marshal. You see, way long ago, during, roughly before Third War of Armageddon, Helbrecht was the new High Marshal of the Black Templar, and he needed to do a crusade to unify his brothers so they can understand that he is in charge, so he can gain their respect, their honor, etc., etc. He went in war against the cythor fiends. And the cythor fiends are very alien species indeed. Their weapons and their very own ships and their buildings are all made of crystal structures that just defy the laws of physics. They defy it because they exist on a different plane of existence than we do. They're not warp creatures. They're just extra-dimensional. They can perceive dimensions that we cannot. This is why when you enter their relatively small holdings, you'll realize that the rooms don't make sense. Like, the closet could be extremely extravagantly large as a fucking mansion from Resident Evil 1. But then, when you go to their living room, where they breed and stuff like that, it could be extremely tiny, despite the fact that the door frame doesn't match the building. Like, you can open up the door, and you'll realize that, like, halfway down the doorway is just this solid wall, and that's the ceiling. So you have to crawl under to get into the room. It's just a tiny room. It's very extra-dimensional. It doesn't make sense from a war perspective, but it does make sense scientifically. It's a dimension. Every time you open up a door, it could lead to a different room. These are little pockets, extra dimensions that only cythor fiends could understand. Now, the reason why we're talking about this in a Jormungandr video is because when Helbrecht finally nearly wiped out the cythor fiends, they went to their homeworld and it was mysteriously empty. It was actually abandoned. There were still many, many infrastructures floating in the skies. There's many, many scans that would show, okay, cythor fiend technology is there, but there is no cythor fiends. So where the fuck did they go? Most likely they're just hiding somewhere in the planet. They're hiding somewhere in their very own alien technology and alien structures. This is where Hive Jormungandr would come in. If they're fighting alien species who could just disappear into another pocket, into another dimension that none of us can perceive, then there's only one way to fight them, is to wait for them to come out. This is much like hunting. If a mole rat burrows into the ground and I can no longer reach my arm into that tunnel that he dug himself, I'm just going to wait. I could maybe set up a few traps. I can maybe make it where he's only got one way of exit. I could maybe make it where if he does spring up, he's just going to spring up and get impaled by a large knife. This is where Hive Jormungandr comes in, is if the aliens that they're fighting are extra-dimensional beings who can perceive things that the Hive Fleet cannot perceive, then they'll just wait. They'll wait them out. Let's see how long that technology sustains you. Let's see how long that technology can keep you alive. Let's see how long hiding in this little pocket realm is going to keep you sustained when I stay here for over 10,000 years in hibernation, just waiting for you to come out. This is where Hive Jormungandr is amazing, because while they're waiting, they can also weaken the very foundations of the crust of the planet. So the moment you step foot, boom, it turns into a massive sinkhole. Just a massive manhole full of maws and teeth ready to rip you to shreds. So, Hive Jormungandr's weirdness can be easily explained if you look at where it was, which is the Ghoul stars. But we can also factor in what galaxy that came from. It could have came from a weird-ass galaxy, as I said, full of mole people, full of Skaven, full of who knows what kind of burrowing species. So it makes sense that the Hive Jormungandr would be specialized in that, because that was the best way to attack those species. Who knows? But that is it for me. That has been Freeze 700. I am out. Please comment down below what you guys think. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this subject, and I hope you guys, as always, comment down below what you guys want to see next. See you guys next time.